Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the FAO webinar to present the Regional Review of Aquaculture for Northern America, which is the fourth installment of a 7-webinar series that we are presenting this week. My name is Austin Stankus, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Thank you all for joining us here. Before we begin, 2 important points. First, be sure to use the question and answer box to submit your questions. And second, please note that this webinar will be recorded. We will begin today's session with welcome remarks from Matthias Halvaert, the head of the aquaculture branch of FAO's Fisheries Division. Matthias, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Austin. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good day to all of you. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is the 4th in a series of 7 consecutive webinars. There are a number of important reasons for FAO to be organizing these events this week. First, the year 2020 has kicked off with a reaffirmation of our global commitment and call for coordinated and accelerated actions towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. So what role can and will aquaculture play in this decade of action? And what actions should be prioritized for a better impact of aquaculture, particularly for the Zero Hunger goal, but also for many others? These are key questions we had wanted to discuss at the FAO NACA Global Conference on Aquaculture Millennium Plus 20, which was supposed to be held in Shanghai this week. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to postpone the conference, and in agreement with our host, the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, is now scheduled for new dates 22 to 27 September 2021. Now, proposing future actions for greater impact in aquaculture should be informed by sound knowledge, by facts and figures. And that brings me to my second point. At FAO, we have been compiling these reviews since 1995, every 5 years. And we are about to complete the 2020 edition right now. So providing our latest results, as we had planned it to be done in Shanghai, is precisely the background and purpose for engaging with you now. And what will be presented today are the key messages, are the challenges, and the options for the way forward in the North America region. Presentations and discussions with distinguished panelists representing different stakeholder groups will complement the agenda, and I believe we can all look forward to a very interesting and stimulating exchange. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Matthias, for those words. We will now have some opening remarks from Danielle Blacklock. Danielle is the director of the NOAA Office of Aquaculture in the National Marine Fisheries Service of the United States. And in this role, she oversees the aquaculture component of NOAA's sustainable seafood portfolio. And she leads the office's work on regulation, policy, science, outreach, and the international activities in support of U.S. aquaculture. So without further ado, we will begin with some opening remarks. Ricardo, could you please share the video?
Hello, I'm Danielle Blacklock, the director of the Office of Aquaculture in the National Marine Fisheries Service, part of the U.S. government. I'd also like to thank our neighbors to the north in the Canadian government for making sure that I'm able to represent North America in this introduction to the Regional Review for Aquaculture. The US and Canada, combined as North America, make small contributions to global aquaculture production, with Canada producing 191 tons in 2018, 79% of which was Atlantic salmon, and the United States producing 315 tons of aquaculture produced in 2016, largely from freshwater catfish and shellfish, mostly oysters. The US is a big importer of seafood. We import more than 85% of the seafood consumed, resulting in a $16.8 billion trade deficit annually. We actually import a lot of our seafood from Canada. Canada exports about 60% of their aquaculture production to the United States, showing that we share not only a coastline and waters, but also a marketplace. There are a number of changes that have happened over the past 5 years that I'd like to highlight for you as we enter into this regional review. One is the increased production of macroalgae. Along the northeast, northwest, and Alaskan coasts of the United States, macroalgae culture is growing, and we're excited to see that. In addition, in the United States, we currently have 16 different recirculating aquaculture projects that are in various stages of development. Some are still seeking investment, while others have actually harvested for the first time. As we talk about land-based, we also have the Canadian government evaluating whether it makes sense to transition from net pen culture in British Columbia to land-based systems. So those are some changes that could be coming down the line. One big change that we're all feeling globally is the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all are experiencing and grappling with this within our families and within our countries, the North American aquaculture industry is being hit very hard, especially our shellfish growers. Because shellfish is largely sold in restaurants, their market dried up almost instantaneously. Not many people know how to shuck their own oysters. Both the Canadian governments and the government of the United States have put together different packages and programs to try to help during this economic hardship and help support this resilient industry, but it remains to be seen whether what's being done is enough and whether there will be long-lasting impacts on the industry from this pandemic. There have also been really exciting things that have happened over the past 5 years, though. We have made large advancements in research. We in the United States have started strategic planning for research across the government, looking across all of the different agencies that have aquaculture assets and looking to use innovation to spur development in the future. We've also done an internal review of our science program within the National Marine Fisheries Service for aquaculture. And that review has highlighted gaps and potential opportunities for growth. Also, the Canadians have made big investments in clean technology, as they see clean technology as a way to improve the environmental performance of both fisheries and aquaculture. New technology has also come across through the feeds market. We've seen new research showing that we can decouple the need for wild harvested fish going into fish meal and fish oil to feed farmed fish. That research is really promising and could change this potential future sustainability of aquaculture as a whole. We've also seen advancements in risk assessments. The Canadian government has pioneered new risk assessments related to potential impacts and risks from farmed Atlantic salmon to some of their wild salmon populations, showcasing that no more risks are borne on the wild populations than they would be exposed to without the aquaculture there. In addition, we've closed the life cycle on a new species that's ready for commercialization. Over the past 10 years, NOAA scientists have worked diligently to bring a new species, sablefish, also known as black cod, into the ready world for commercialization, and we're there, and that's so exciting. In addition, we've been doing a lot of work on social acceptance. Social acceptance of aquaculture in North America is a challenge and a barrier to development in many cases. We've been working to make sure that our public is educated on what sustainable aquaculture looks like and what it could be in our waters. We've worked with aquariums to make sure that aquaculture is part of the curriculum that they're teaching visitors, and we've even worked with grocery store chains to make sure that their seafood mongers, their fishmongers, are able to answer all of the questions of the public when they come to that fish counter. We've seen a lot of gains when it comes to social acceptance of aquaculture in North America, and that, among many other reasons, is why our future is so bright. This past May in the United States, the president signed an executive order, and that executive order outlined a suite of actions to enable aquaculture production here in the United States. Those include developing a national aquaculture development plan. and a revolutionary concept for us, which is creating aquaculture opportunity areas. This idea of proactively doing spatial analysis to find appropriate space for aquaculture to grow in the most sustainable way possible is something that we have seen many other nations do successfully, and we're grateful that we can learn from them. In addition, I mentioned those recirculating aquaculture farms. If those 16 farms and any more actually come online, they're going to revolutionize the amount of production of aquaculture species in the United States. In addition, and possibly the most exciting thing that could change our future, is that both the governments of Canada and the United States are looking at legislation specific for aquaculture. These new laws would create forward-looking permitting systems that would really enhance and enable smart and sustainable growth of aquaculture industries in our countries. As I look to the future, I really see the pieces coming together and that change is afoot. I'm grateful for the regional review that has been completed looking at the last 5 years, and I really anticipate looking at the one that comes down the line in the next 5 years, because I think we're going to see a lot of real change. The pieces have aligned, and both the countries of Canada and the United States are looking to increase their aquaculture production, and we're grateful for all of the collaborators that are making sure that's possible. I look forward to your participation in this regional review, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Danielle, for those remarks and that fascinating overview of the recent developments and the new innovations in aquaculture in North America, and providing some of your insight on what's coming down the road in the near future. And thanks also for not only mentioning the positives, but also highlighting some of those challenges facing the sector, as well as the responses being taken, notably regarding COVID-19. I would now like to introduce the author of the regional review, Dr. Stephen Cross. Steve, if you could go ahead and start to share your screen. Steve is the Director of Applied Research at the Conestoga Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning in Ontario. And he is also the CEO of the Global Aquafood Development Corp, as well as faculty at the University of Victoria. All right, Steve, we can see your screen, so please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Austin. Thank you to FAO Aquaculture for giving me the opportunity to work through World Fisheries Trust to produce this draft copy of the regional review for Northern America. It's been a pleasure to work with the colleagues in FAO and WFT. So I look forward to the inputs through the chat box of the participants today in acquiring further insights into changes we need to make for the final document as it moves forward. So let me proceed then. And with the authorship of this document, I was the lead author for this particular review, and I worked with a colleague here at Conestoga College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning, Dr. Christina Soto. She did a part of this as well, and of course the FAO reviewers in Rome that have gone through the initial draft of the document and provided insights and comments for change of the document itself. The North American region for this particular review includes the territories, the French territory of Saint-Pierre-Miquelon on the eastern coast of Canada below Newfoundland, the British territory of Bermuda off the eastern seaboard of the United States, sort of northeast of Miami, as well as Greenland. And of course, Canada and the United States being the two biggest players. The first three are small territories. While there is a small development of aquaculture in Saint-Pierre-Miquelon, there has been little change in that over the last 5 years. Bermuda and Greenland have expressed interest in developing forms of aquaculture, but are not quite there yet. And the review does provide commentary on their interests and the sectors as they move forward. The majority of the document, if you've gone through this, is focused on, of course, Canada and the United States, as Danielle mentioned just a few moments ago. The main data sources for this review included the FAO global data sets, including the country data up to 2018. It included government statistical reports, for example, NOAA's NMFS databases, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canadian databases on aquaculture, as well as input from industry associations were available throughout the North American region, and of course through the scientific literature itself. In comparing the previous study, which was completed in 2016 for the previous 5 years, trends that continue in North America include a relative steady state of aquaculture production. It includes an increase in production value. We continue to have some, albeit less, challenges with social license. And we have had, and as Danielle alluded to, changes coming down the pipe with regard to regulatory issues with aquaculture, but previous to that, there has been some burden with regulation in facilitating growth. And the new and changing trends for aquaculture in this region include growing interest in species diversification and importance placed on ocean and climate change and how farms will adapt to those changes. And of course, also mentioned a growing interest in seaweeds throughout the United States and Canada itself. There are 8 key messages that we put forward for the North American review. You may have heard 10 or so on the other countries. We just focused it down to 8. These included a couple of the many of the issues we just outlined as continuing trends and changes. But the first being a relatively steady state of regional aquaculture production. North America contributes a small amount of aquaculture production if you view it in a global context, somewhere between 600 and 650,000 metric tons annually. It has basically stabilized with very little change in that production over the last 15 years or so. And you can see the upper bar graph showing in the light blue for the United States and the darker blue down below of Canada itself, that relatively steady total production state over time. The red line shows that the proportion of that contribution in terms of the global production. And despite a leveling off and a steady state of production here in North America, that represents a declining contribution to the global production context. So we were at about 3.5% of global production in the early 1990s, and we're now at less than 1%. So it shows that while we're in a steady state, other regions of the world, of course, are increasing production significantly. But despite the steady production levels that we see here in North America, there's been a steady increase in the value of North American production over the entire last decade, 2 decades and a half. So if you look at the lower figure here, you see that both in the United States and in Canada, the value of that production, albeit relatively steady, has grown continuously over that period of time. The options for a way forward in terms of this key message is to work to expand current growing areas. Danielle mentioned that the fact that there were currently initiatives in place to facilitate that kind of growth in North America, which has not been there in the previous 5 years. But that's there's a credible opportunity in this region, and if it's realized, we're gonna see a significant increase in production. And of course, to expand markets both regionally and internationally, and maintain that market relationship between the 2 major players in the North American region. Expanding markets is one of the key messages here. There's a current restructuring and expansion of free trade agreements or trade agreements between North American parties, not only between the NAFTA or the North American Free Trade Agreement, but between the US and Canada and Mexico, but also new initiatives such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's global demand for seafood products is seen as a probable stimulant to increase local production or the supply of aquaculture products in order to satisfy the much larger and diversified global marketplace. The ways forward: continue to support and build on the strength of the North American free trade markets, and to work to develop new international markets for high quality and high valued seafood products. Increasing value of North American production. Production volume and the overall sector have had limited growth owing to several challenges. However, the value of the products, as I mentioned earlier and showed you in that bar graph, has been increasing over time. This has been primarily a result, we feel, related to value-added initiatives, whether it's branding, eco-certification, processing, packaging initiatives, et cetera, have all contributed to an increase in unit value of the production that's occurred here in North America. Options for the way forward, or continue along this path, is for sector growth should continue to embrace value-added initiatives and look to address consumer needs and diversify product lines accordingly. Diversification of species. There has been an interest in diversifying species for a number of reasons. This has been attributed to challenges associated with environmental sustainability and reducing impacts, initiatives such as integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, where you're introducing extractive species in addition to the monoculture fed species to intercept, extract, and convert nitrogenous waste into secondary or tertiary products. It's also occurred, this diversification, as an adaptive strategy for climate and ocean change. So farmers see it as a way to pivot into different species or producing more than one species in order to minimize their business risk associated with that. And of course, it can also be related to market issues and importation, competition from other product pricing impacts, et cetera. Selection of species with high value has often offset constraints in increasing production volume as well. Options for the way forward: we see that enabling applied research collaborations to facilitate new species development and commercialization is a critical piece for the North American sector. Technology integration. Technology is big in North America. Technology innovation and application have contributed to increases in farm site productivity and have resulted in decreased and associated cost of production for a number of different species. Examples include production system design, whether it's a monoculture system or multi-species configurations, IMTA, that sort of thing. The application of genomics in broodstock development and an adaptation to climate change, for example, for processing efficiencies, new technologies in processing itself, in feed innovations, et cetera. Options forward in this particular key message is to continue to support the integration of technology in North American production and encourage innovation through business incentives for technology development. Social license has, for at least a couple of decades, been an issue in North America. The negative public perceptions associated with aquaculture industry in terms of its environmental sustainability have continued to have an impact on North American aquaculture sector growth. Danielle alluded to the fact that that's changing, and it most recently has, and it has shown a improve in the image of the industry sector over the last 10 years or so, and that is increased due to things like branding, success stories, community partnership, indigenous peoples endorsements of aquaculture, third-party certifications, et cetera. So there has been slow movement in converting that negativity into a more positive environment for sector growth. Options for the way forward: further development and implementation of effective communication strategies to educate the North American consumer on all aspects of aquatic farming. So much like the milk industry did with the moustache years ago, and advertising like that to get that image of it's good for you, and it's a great option to other types of food that I see the sector going forward in helping to get that negativity put aside. growing interest in the production of seaweeds. North America is beginning to embrace the opportunities associated with seaweeds. The coastal areas of Canada, the United States, and Greenland have optimal production environments and stimulating interest in either co-culture as an option for farm diversification or as commercial scale operations with single or multiple seaweed species. I was one of the pioneers of integrated multi-trophic aquaculture and was licensed for seaweed some 15 years ago. And you couldn't get anybody to listen to you when you mentioned the word seaweed at all. Now it is in the forefront of discussions when you talk about aquaculture in North America, whether it's the East Coast or West Coast. So it's an exciting opportunity, exciting time in North America in that regard. It's a brand new sector and something that has a lot of potential. For example, the Pacific Northwest is home to some over 630 different species of seaweeds. It's one of the richest areas on the planet for seaweeds, yet we do virtually nothing in terms of farming or even wild harvesting. So opportunity is incredible. So the options for the way forward here are to enable applied research to facilitate new species development and commercialization, use the North American strength and technology to explore seaweed product development. So not just focusing on food, but on extractives, biofuels, nutraceuticals, that sort of thing as well, and provide business incentives for seaweed sector development. The final key message for this review is related to regulatory burden as a constraint. And over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen this as a growing issue rather than a growing solution. But recent developments, as Danielle mentioned, both in Canada and in the US, are pretty encouraging in terms of how we move forward in the next 5 years. But at the time of the first draft of this report, regulatory burden was still an issue and remains high in North American jurisdiction. Excessive and sometimes poorly harmonized regulations have had an impact on cost of doing business, for example. Comprehensive regulatory framework that has started to be developed to satisfy public perception has worked in certain areas and provided some input on that social license issue as well. Options for the way forward, which again, I think we're moving towards, is an efficient yet enabling regulatory environment for the sector while maintaining protections for the environment, coastal and land use management, as well as seafood safety. So it's encouraging to hear Danielle's words and in the United States, the president's executive order for a move forward with aquaculture, and in Canada, the development of a new aquaculture act that's specific for the development of a vibrant sector here. So looking rosy for the road ahead. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to your input to this final draft for a final document. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for this presentation and emphasizing some of these most important trends of the aquaculture sector in Northern America over these last years, as well as identifying some of those challenges while at the same time providing options for the way forward. So to complement Steve's presentation, we have invited 3 prominent figures in the aquaculture sector here with us today as panelists, and we've asked them to share insights on specific aspects of aquaculture in the region. The panelists are actually here with us today, but we'll start with a pre-recorded video intervention from each. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the panelists. First speaking, we'll have Mark Lawrence, a professor at Mississippi State University. Mark also serves as the director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Fish, a USAID-funded initiative supporting research and development of aquaculture and fisheries in developing countries in Africa and Asia. And Mark will be talking about recent developments in catfish aquaculture in the US, and notably on the role of innovation. After Mark, we will have Susan Farquharson, who is the executive director of the Atlantic Canada Fish Farmers Association. And Susan has been a longtime advocate for water and ocean development, advising various projects and managing several nonprofits and environmental NGOs in the sector. And Susan will be speaking about social license, focusing mostly on the role of governance. And then finally, our third panelist is Brent Smith, a lifelong commercial fisherman turned ocean farmer who has pioneered regenerative ocean farming on his farm on Long Island Sound. And Brent is the executive director and co-founder of Green Wave, an organization that trains and supports regenerative ocean farmers around the world. So like I said, the panelists are here with us today, but we'll start with the video. Ricardo, please, if you could share.
Hello, my name is Mark Lawrence, and I'm a professor of aquatic animal health and director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Fish at Mississippi State University. It is my pleasure and honor to participate in today's panel on the FAO Regional Review of Aquaculture for North America. U.S. aquaculture is a very diverse industry with multiple species of finfish, mollusks, and crustaceans produced in a variety of production systems. Today, I will focus on catfish aquaculture, which is the major aquaculture industry in the southeastern U.S., with my own state of Mississippi being the largest producer. 33% of the aquaculture value in the U.S. is in catfish production, and 70% of the volume of finfish production is accounted for by catfish. The trend in catfish production is that the industry is consolidating with fewer producers, but increasing productivity per acre. In the US, catfish production is still being done primarily using pond production systems. In catfish production, as in the other aquaculture industries in the US, research and development of improved aquaculture technology is important in all of the production systems to improve efficiency, profitability, and sustainability. Some of the technologies that are increasing yield per acre in catfish production include the use of a controlled breeding to produce hybrid catfish with increased growth and disease resistance, increased use of aeration in catfish ponds, and split pond technologies, which are being used to manage nitrogenous waste. Some of the major limitations or constraints to growth of catfish production include compensation, or the margin of price per pound of finished product versus production costs, which is affected in the US by imports, which includes Pangasius and related whitefish products. Input costs of feed, labor, and electricity also limit catfish growth, as well as availability of quality labor. Surprisingly, bird predation has a direct impact on losses of catfish due to fish-eating birds that are migrating through the catfish pond-producing areas and consuming fish, and the birds also contribute significantly to disease transmission by transmitting diseases from pond to pond. Unlike other aquaculture production systems in the US, government regulation is not a major constraint in catfish production. But one of the major strengths of US catfish production is its low environmental impact. Catfish raised in ponds are rated as one of the best choices in terms of environmental impact by the Seafood Watch program. Water replacement in these pond systems only replaces evaporation. So the ponds are only filled 3 to 4 times of their total volume over a 12 to 15 year period. No effluents are discharged from catfish production ponds. So these systems are very efficient in terms of land, water, labor, capital, and energy use. That concludes my talk, and I would like to thank the FAO for this opportunity to participate in today's panel and for your attention. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Farquharson, and the importance of social license, as noted in the regional review, struck a chord with me in my role as Executive Director of the Atlantic Canada Fish Farmers Association. Thank you for this opportunity to add my voice to that particular conversation. And I'd like to use my time to emphasize the importance that effective governance plays in social license in North America, and specifically, because of where I am, in the Canadian context. As the report noted, social license continues to be the greatest challenge facing the North American aquaculture sector. However, I do believe the important role of aquaculture in food security is being recognized more as a result of the current global pandemic. Marine aquaculture in North America operates in the public domain using a public resource, our oceans. Unlike fisheries, which is more universally accepted as a result of hundreds of years of development, differently around the world, of course, farming the oceans is a relatively new use of that public resource in North America. And I, as well as other progressive environmentalists, believe it can be a better way of utilizing our oceans. Because aquaculture, like water, is not mentioned in the Canadian Constitution, its management has been, to say the least, fragmented. And this fragmented arrangement to manage the aquaculture industry under a fisheries mandate in Canada continues to create public acceptance challenges for the sector, therefore stifling development. Even in British Columbia, where the courts have decided the Fisheries and Oceans, the federal agency responsible for fish and fish habitat protection, would manage the industry, they do so under their Fisheries Act, which was not written to manage fish farming. And as a result, the agency is continually being taken to court, charged by aquaculture opposers with violating their mandate of fish and fish habitat protection by managing the aquaculture sector. Being drawn into public court battles that reflect negatively on the industry and, of course, social license. On the east coast of Canada, the provinces are the principal aquaculture managers of the industry with separate legislation in each province. Their role as both regulator and promoter of the sector is often criticized by those opposed to the sector, as they believe the federal government holds the mandate for oceans management under which aquaculture should be managed. Fisheries and Oceans acts as a dedicated federal agency to serve as a regulator, science advisor, and a promoter for the fishery. But there is no such federal body for the aquaculture industry. And as a result, you have a sector that is managed under various pieces of legislation by various regulators at various levels of government. This fragmented system of governance that continues to have social license consequences for the aquaculture in Canada is an aspect I wanted to bring to the attention of the reviewers and the audience. It is one that I believe can be resolved with the establishment of a dedicated agency for aquaculture, a step that would provide the industry with the agency it requires to be a regulator, a science advisor, and a promoter. This, like the fishery, would contribute tremendously to addressing social license challenges by clarifying the management of the sector and providing them with a federal promoter. I want to thank you for this time and look forward to our continued conversations. Thank you.
Hi there, it's a total honor to be here today. My name is Brent Smith. I'm a regenerative ocean farmer. I used to be a commercial fisherman, but slowly have transitioned into the ocean farming space. I grow a mix of shellfish and seaweeds in a single area using the entire water column, vertically, growing as many different species as possible in one area, so we're a polyculture system, and our farms are replicable, right? The overhead costs are low enough that we're able to spread the farms throughout the US and elsewhere. We see this is important because regenerative ocean farming goes beyond the goal of sustainability, right? It's not about lowering impact, it's actually about farming to breathe life back into our oceans, capturing carbon, filtering out nitrogen, using the farms to rebuild reefs, and everything we grow is zero inputs, right? We ask the ocean, what does it make sense to grow? And it says, why don't you grow things that don't swim away and you don't have to feed, right? So we don't use fresh water, fertilizer, a land, of course, no feed. And this is really important, you know, both because the environmental benefits, but also it really lowers the barrier to entry so that the overhead costs are low enough that it makes us as farmers climate resilient if our farms are destroyed in you know, the brutal weather, hurricanes, things like that. And beyond that, I think it's important because as a farmer, it opens up many, many different markets, right? So we do ingredients such as kelp and seaweed flours, plant-based burgers. We use our crops as fertilizer and compost on land-based farms, and they're turned into bioplastic, you know, alternative straws and packaging based out of a seaweed. We also see real opportunity in the blue carbon space. We'll be generating in the next 12 months the first blue carbon credit from a regenerative farm. And the way we do that is we take a certain percentage of our crop and we get it into the soil. We sequester it in land-based farms. And this allows us to create a nutrient loop and a really virtuous circle between land and sea agriculture. Now, 6 years ago, started GreenWave, which is a nonprofit to train the next generation of ocean farmers. We've got a high touch program where we do training around the country, but also low touch with toolkits, farmer dashboards, platforms, digital co-ops. Our goal is to train 10,000 farmers in the next 10 years. We have a waiting list right now of 6,000 people just in the US and request to start farms in over 100 countries. As I look here in the US, I see a whole bunch of opportunities and challenges. And just quickly to hit a few, I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration between East and West throughout the world. Through the 1950s, we're starting with Dr. Drew Baker, who closed the life cycle on nori. East and West has been collaborating. We need to bring back that ethic. I think FAO could play an important role as a convener to share visions of the oceans, lessons, and opportunities. The other big challenge and question is what is this economy going to look like out at sea? Is it going to replicate the global agribusiness industry, or will we do something else? Will we privatize seed? Will communities actually benefit from this new economy? Will indigenous rights to the ocean be protected? And what's exciting for us is that we can actually build a new kind of economy, a new blue economy with different principles out in the ocean that addresses climate, addresses jobs, justice, and community resilience all at the same time. So our goal is really not growth at any cost. It's about learning the lessons from land, learning the lessons from aquaculture, and really trying to make a living on a living planet. So thanks so much, and happy to be here.
Thank you to all of the panelists for these interesting and informative and impactful remarks. Thank you. This brings us to the question and answer portion of our webinar. So we are taking questions from the question and answer box, as well as some that have already been submitted. So the first question today is for Steve. Steve, in your presentation, in the review, you stated that there's an increasing interest for First Nations communities to develop aquaculture operations. Could you expand a little bit more on that topic? Is there a specific type of aquaculture that's attracted this interest? And how does this mesh with the social license issues?
Thanks, Austin. My comments on First Nation will be using the Pacific Northwest as an example. That's my area where I've spent most of my career in coastal British Columbia. But that area has a lot of sensitivity in terms of social license over the last 30 years. And a lot of that has impacted coastal First Nation communities. There's 112 different nations along the coast of coastal British Columbia, and they have all individually have different viewpoints on aquaculture, but it all stemmed from the negativity associated with finfish aquaculture, salmon aquaculture, so fed aquaculture, and the impacts that were publicized routinely: the use of antibiotics, the waste feed buildup, the escapes, the genetic impacts, the impacts on wild fishery. The negativity associated with that particular sector had a major impact on the remote rural communities of those First Nations communities. And unfortunately, it tainted aquaculture across the board, not only the finfish, but shellfish and crustacea, et cetera. And it's only recently that the coastal First Nations have seen that while there are issues with finfish aquaculture, that these other sectors are completely different. And as a result, communities have in the wake of declining fisheries, wild fisheries, have looked to aquaculture, maybe not necessarily finfish aquaculture, but perhaps shellfish aquaculture as economic opportunities for the community members. And given the fact that First Nations in the remote areas of Alaska, Washington, British Columbia were actually aquaculturists 10,000 years ago, it's not surprising that shellfish aquaculture, clams, oysters, that sort of thing is probably the first area of interest for them. And they have embraced that. With seaweed now of interest across the board, that is particularly of interest to First Nations on the West Coast. It is a seasonal crop, and it lends itself to that kind of a lifestyle where you're planting, let it grow, harvest it as farming would, and it's not maintaining 365 a year. So there's a lot of interest there. As a result of those communities moving towards aquaculture operations of their own, of course, less cost to get into something like seaweed than would be fish farming. They are becoming advocates of the use of the oceans for ocean farming, if you will. They may not fully endorse the finfish side yet, but they are advocates for aquaculture as a whole. And as a result, that is having a positive spin on, of course, the social license, the perceptions that this is an impact to these types of communities, et cetera.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for those remarks. Very comprehensive answer. Our next question is for Mark. In your video intervention, you spoke about technology and innovation and how they've been used to increase the profitability of catfish production and also reduce environmental impact. In your view, what are some of the actions necessary to enable collaboration among the different stakeholders, among government, private sector, and the research community in order to facilitate or drive innovation?
Thanks, Austin. Yes, it's a good question. So I'm a little biased. I work at a land grant university, and the land grant university system in the U.S. is a unique system that has a central role in the development of innovation and transfer that technology to the producers. So I think the land grant universities play a key role in this, but the U.S. support from the U.S. government and the state governments are also key. For example, the USDA, National Institute for Food and Agriculture, supports a competitive grant program to stimulate development of technologies, which here in our college, we've had funding to support development of vaccines for catfish and for programs to support monitoring of antimicrobial resistance. And so that's a key part, but the extension, so land grant universities play a key role in extension and transfer of technology, which receives support from both the federal government and state governments. And so our program here at Mississippi State University to monitor and mitigate antimicrobial resistance is a really good example. So we work closely with the farmers. Of course, the U.S. has implemented the Veterinary Feed Directive rule, so all antimicrobial use is under the approval and under the diagnosis of a licensed veterinarian. But every case that comes into our diagnostic lab from the catfish industry, we culture, we document any incidents of antimicrobial resistance. We're now sequencing all those isolates, and we're working with industry to track, antimicrobial resistance is a transmissible gene, and we're using this to monitor. And happy to report that we're not seeing an increase in that the responsible management of antimicrobial use is working. But we're part of a global community, and the collaboration with FAO is key in this. And so Mississippi State University has been a partner with FAO in sponsoring several congressional briefings over the last few years to help inform Congress and the public about the importance of aquaculture, managing antimicrobial resistance, and key issues. And of course, we've been working hand in hand with FAO on the development of the progressive management pathway for aquaculture biosecurity, which is an issue for the US, Canada, and for all the countries that are implementing aquaculture. Disease is a recurring problem. But I just also like to mention our ongoing collaboration with the USAID and FAO through our Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Fish. We're working hand in hand with FAO and Matthias to implement projects in Nigeria and other countries together to develop aquaculture to solve nutrition problems sustainably around the world. So anyway, great question. And thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Mark. There's so much more we can talk about, but unfortunately, we only have a few minutes today. We'll move on to another question for Bren. Bren, we heard a lot today about diversification of species, diversification of products, and we all know that there's a lot of types of seaweed and there's lots of uses of seaweed. But what is the role of diversification in your business planning as well as sort of the wider seaweed sector? Please. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. For us, diversification is the key to climate resiliency, not only in terms of farm survival, but also durable business models, right? So there's diversification of species. So if the crop fails, the farm still survives, right? So if my kelp is wiped out early in the season because of a hurricane, I've still got mussels to harvest. And then also external challenges like COVID. So we were throwing away thousands, millions of oysters here on the East Coast because all the restaurants shut down, but the seaweed actually allowed us to stabilize and have a market beyond that. So it was key to food security. Helps us stay ahead of the climate curve because we're always trying to introduce new species. Like, I'm not going to be growing kelp in 10 years if temperatures keep going up. So I need that sort of that front edge growing. And then, something like the halo effect, which we found that surrounding oyster farms with seaweed reduces levels of acidification in the center. That's incredible work out of Puget Sound. And then diversification of income and markets is what I care more about in many ways as a farmer, is that because seaweeds especially can be used, my farm this sold ingredients like flour and plant-based burgers. We did the bioplastics for straws specifically this year, and then fertilizer and compost and ag. That means that I have just all these different options, but it goes beyond that. So we think of the farm as the future, 4 quadrants: farming food, using our waste for agricultural and other byproducts, farming for ecosystem services like blue carbon, and also farming data. Every one of our farms is a data platform. We think that has value. We can be feeding data into the cloud, and farmers should benefit and be paid for that data. And that's what climate resiliency looks like: multiple products, multiple markets, and multiple crops.
Thank you, Brent. Diversification as resilience, that is fascinating. Our next question is for Danielle, if you're still with us, Danielle. We have a question from the chat that says, social acceptance and social license is important, but that alone is not necessarily enough to drive national aquaculture development, as there are still other issues to be addressed, such as freshwater resources or marine space allocation, spatial planning. So in your opinion, will the acceptance that aquaculture can be done sustainably, is that enough to convince the North American population that local production will be an important source of seafood in the future?
Thank you, Austin. And the asker of the question is correct, that the challenges facing aquaculture development in North America are more broad than social acceptance. However, social acceptance plays a role in many of them. So as we look to find available space for aquaculture and appropriate space in our waters, there has to be a willingness to do so as we look at making our regulatory system more efficient and effective without changing any of the sustainability goals, but just making the process work a bit more seamlessly. There has to be social acceptance that that's a good idea. It's that the foundation of social acceptance feeds into so much of our work. Interestingly, it doesn't feed into the marketplace. The US, I mentioned in the opening, imports 85%, over 85% of our seafood. More than 50% of that is farmed, and it sells in the grocery store and the seafood counter just fine. The place that social acceptance really enters in is in the not in my backyard conversations, in these policy fora, and sort of as we look across to all of the needs of industry, whether it be that regulatory piece, whether it be economic development, finding loans and workforce development components,
or even research, you can see how the tendrils of social acceptance sort of feed into all of those conversations. That's why we talk about it so often.
Thank you, Danielle. Very comprehensive. Unfortunately, I'm afraid this is almost all the time that we have for today. I see very many questions popping up in the chat, and unfortunately we just can't address all of them now, but I assure you that we will take note of all of these questions, and as we work towards finalizing this review with Steve and with some of our other thematic reviews and the preparation of the Global Conference on Aquaculture, we will consider all of these questions and reflect on them and make sure that they are covered. So I will now ask Matthias Halvart again to provide some final thoughts and closing remarks. Matthias, please. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Austin, and many thanks to all of you, really, all the panelists, all the ones who have spoken, all the ones who have commented, for such an interesting hour of information exchange on aquaculture in the Northern America region. And I'm pleased to share a few concluding thoughts with you. Well, first, the aquaculture production expanding in value in Northern America, even though the production volume remaining mostly steady over these last years, that's something I find very interesting. And it really highlights why it is so important to look at the regional particularities as we conduct reviews such as these. And this higher value for the same volume of product is primarily a result of value-adding initiatives. We also heard about this from other regions, which is expected to continue. And the response to market forces, environmental sustainability, and the customer demands have led to changes in production, including this diversification of species that Brent just alluded to, and that adds the resilience to the system, but also the emergence of various certifications and other effects being also changes in workforce, and a drive towards innovation. And innovation we have heard a lot about over the past days. In fact, technology innovation that Mark mentioned and its application have contributed to increases in productivity and also to decreases in associated costs of production, but also in the environmental footprint. And we heard clearly the need for wide collaboration to enable a further development, extension, and use of these new technologies, both within the region, but really also around the world. And I can assure you this is a message that FAO takes to heart. Another point that struck me was the burgeoning interest really in North America in the opportunities associated with seaweed aquaculture that Brent so eloquently alluded to. And this is an exciting area for new expansion, and especially interesting in terms of novel biotechnological applications that algae can play. And of course, the extractive nature of marine seaweed culture with very positive environmental impacts. And then we heard about and talked about this major issue of social license, and that this continues to have an impact on North American sector growth. And really important actions to achieve a better consumer acceptability of aquaculture, that this needs to engage many, if not all, stakeholders across the sector and across really other sectors as well. And talking about social license brings me to my final point on the point of, or the topic of governance. And recognizing the differences between the countries that Danielle pointed out, and also between the different environments, between freshwater and marine environments, the regulatory burden has historically limited aquaculture development. And so it's good news then that specifically in marine waters, there are these recent developments towards harmonization of policies and certifications, which will reduce permitting costs, encourage investor confidence, and will react to consumer demands, all while putting at the same time in place the required environmental and social safeguards. We've covered a lot of ground here. Thank you so much to our panelists, to our moderator, to the ones who worked hard behind the scenes to make this 4th webinar happen. Thanks again, and back to you, Austin.
Thank you, Matthias, for those closing remarks. And I wish to echo you and to thank everyone who has participated here today, to Danielle, to Steve, to Mark and Susan and Bren, and to everyone working behind the scenes to make these webinars and really the reviews themselves a reality. And finally, a special thanks to all of you who have joined us here today to take time out of your day to come and talk about aquaculture in North America. That ends it for us today. Stay safe and take care. Goodbye.